Hello, everyone. I am Mutonrayo Fatoke, a GPE youth leader from Nigeria. Thank you so much for joining this live session. It's the Global Action Week for Education. It's an event organized by the GCE Global Campaign for Education. And GPE, in partnership with GCE, is hosting the Raise Your Hand action. And I would be hosting this live session as a GPE youth leader. I'm really excited about the topic of discourse, which is centered on decolonizing education. I have two incredible and experienced speakers here with me who will be sharing their experiences and best practices on how to decolonize education financing. It is important to note that domestic budget remains the principal source of education financing, which is contributed to the bulk of total financing requirements of the sector. This is why GPE is so concerned with strengthening political will of government, to finance education at the national level. With no further ado, I will just be introducing our two amazing speakers in the person of Judge Hamusunga, who is the Executive Director of Zambia National Education Coalition, and Arthur Larok, who is the ActionAid International Secretary General. Welcome, Judge. Welcome, Arthur. And so my question to you, Judge, in your experience, how does sufficient education financing contribute to the learning crisis in lower income countries?
I think it's important to realize that, domestic financing actually is the hallmark, especially in this case, to the right to education. Domestic financing actually in our countries mainly is constrained by two major factors, globally. The first one being that most of our countries are actually, they are administrating retrogressive tax regimes. They are also, burdened by dates. So the first thing that I would like to explain is the fact that the retrogressive tax regimes that we have in our countries does actually constrain countries to raise enough resources because of the problems associated with unfair tax structures, for instance, that do not allow some multinational companies to pay fair taxes, the illicit financial flows that we have also, where most of the money in our countries does not, go to government in form of taxes, but we lose it through illicit financial flows. Also tax evasions as well as corruption. So those are basically the most important, constraints that we need to address in order for us to ensure that we can generate enough resources from our taxes to finance education.
Thank you so much for shedding light to that context. My next question is going to be to Arthur. This week, thousands of people have raised their hands and their voices for Global Action Week for Education. So what does decolonizing education financing mean to you based on your experience in this sector?
Let me start with the why this is important. I think unless we decolonize education financing, we shall remain in a perpetual cycle of low investment and poor education outcomes. And once you have poor education outcomes, you are really talking about disaffecting the present and the future generation and their potential to transform. So stated more positively, decolonizing education financing has the potential to unleash the full transformative potential of our people for development. So that's why it's very important. Now, in terms of what this means, decolonizing education financing is about challenging distorted power dynamics nationally and internationally that affect decision-making on education. It means reforming colonial-era institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, whose unyielding influence continues to hold many developing countries hostage. Decolonizing education financing also requires us, therefore, actively and collectively push back on the cult of austerity of the IMF and other recommendations they often give to many developing countries of cuts or freezes to public sector wage bills that dramatically affect teachers. And teachers, we know, are the single largest group on the wage bill in many countries. So the IMF effectively blocks recruitment of more teachers, even when there are shortages. The IMF also blocks increases in teachers' pay, even when we know teachers are the most poorly paid in any country. Therefore, there needs to be fundamental systems change in how decision-making and policy to countries is offered. Decolonizing education financing also is about recognizing that global policies on tax that have been controlled by the richer countries, the OECD to be precise, over the last 60 years, need to be reset in a more inclusive and democratic way by agencies like the United Nations, as demanded by the African Ministers of Finance last year. Tax rules must change to stop the continuing plunder of resources in Africa and many developing countries. Decolonization also means taking urgent action to resolve the debt crisis across Africa, so that countries are not spending on debt servicing than they are on education. The country I come from, Uganda, for instance, today, out of all the total revenues that the Uganda Revenue Authority collects, 60.3% of that revenue generated is used for debt servicing. This is just unbelievable. And it's much higher in countries like Kenya, in countries like Ghana. Finally, decolonizing education financing also means challenging power dynamics in the development of national education reforms to ensure that governments, in consultation with their own citizens, are in control. We should push back on the arrogance that some donors have. They are convinced in some respects that they know the best. And I think shift this responsibility rightfully to national governments and citizens of those countries. So that's what education, decolonizing education financing means and why it's so important.
So important to mention that so important to challenge distorted power dynamics, especially with the international community and how they control the dynamics of education reforms. I think it's really, really critical. It's a step towards the right direction. Thank you so much. Over to you, George. I'll ask the same question. What you mean by what you understand based on your own experience on decolonizing education? What do you understand by decolonizing education financing, and how does country ownership of education priorities and policies play in transforming education?
Maybe before I answer that, I can add first on the consequences of inadequate funding on access to quality education. So the problem that comes with inadequate financing of education actually are threefold. First is the equity and inclusion problem, where we know that inadequate funding does not allow us, for instance, to promote equity and bring everyone who is hard to reach in school and be able to provide an environment that they will be able to thrive. The other problem that comes with inadequate financing is the issue of quality, which also has been discussed. The issue of quality is critical because when there is insufficient funding, it means that governments are unable, for instance, to procure the inputs of quality that relate to, for instance, the teachers themselves, the classrooms, laboratories, computers, teaching and learning materials, water supply and sanitation, and a lot of other inputs that can contribute to improved quality. So with little funding to schools, little funding, for instance, for education, we don't expect learning to take place in the classroom. The other problem is the relevance. if there is little funding, we cannot run an efficient education system that is relevant, because mostly it will be theory. We will not be able to provide practical skills that require huge investments in education. And also, if we don't have enough resources, the chances that we will depend on aid, where they will prescribe which sectors or subsectors within education are important, is very high. So they will tell us to invest, for instance, in the lower level and maybe, tertiary and TVET. Some of the examples, for instance, of poor financing within my country relates to what we call community schools. Community schools actually are initiated and operated by communities and established mainly in poor communities where there are no public schools. Now, if you go to these schools, the typical schools that you are going to see there will be, schools with dilapidated infrastructure, mainly made up of mud, poo, and grass. There will be safe drinking water, mainly from shallow wells, using pit latrines as a part of their sanitation, and limited teaching and learning materials. Basically, no computers, no power, and no trained teachers in these schools. And the result of this really is the poor quality of education that we see, where most of the learners in those schools, for instance, don't stay in school for a long time. There are very high dropout, rates. There are also high, early pregnancies, high early marriages, and generally learners drop out and choose to engage in child labor to supplement family income at the expense of going to school. Now, coming back to, decolonizing education financing, I think the definition of decolonizing education financing really is about taking back the control of our enough domestic resource to invest, in our education systems, as opposed to depending on aid, opposed to depending on dates, and as opposed to depending on the public, private partnerships, which, do not give us the ownership that we need, because they come with a lot of prescriptions, as we have heard. So decolonization of education actually is about reducing dependence on external sources of financing in terms of aid, and PPPs, and ensuring that we replace these by progressive taxes. That should be the hallmark for our education financing. That I must emphasize. But the most important thing in doing all this is that governments are expected to ensure that they involve the people. They are expected to ensure that they drive education reforms that are consultative. They are supposed to demonstrate accountability in allowing citizens, for instance, to make decisions around tax, and also in opening up the national and education budget processes for public ownership through multi-stakeholder participation, for instance, in budget making, budget monitoring and review. Also is that the donors are supposed to be very open in providing spaces for citizens to, define their own priorities, as opposed to, prescribing what we need to, use their money for, as we have heard. So this becomes very important. So this shift actually from depending on aid to finance our education systems, which does not provide ownership and which is not sustainable, because donors can go away, and change their priorities depending on the situation or in times of crisis. We are supposed to ensure that as countries, we promote domestic resource mobilization through taxes that are going to be, the hallmark for our investment in the education sector.
Thank you so much, George. I know you mentioned that in terms of countries owning, financing in their countries, because I am also very strong on the belief that he who pays the piper calls the tune. So definitely, if the international community are funding, countries, they also decide where they want the funding to go to, right? But we also know that these are, to finance education as it ought to be, to penetrate every sectors like, infrastructure, equipment like computers, wash facilities. These are in education problems, they intersect. There's the issue of nutrition as well for early childhood education. And so it requires so much resources. And you mentioned that public-private partnerships also are not so effective. I have my own opinion about that, because I think public-private partnership is very strategic and it's an innovative way of, supporting financing in countries, right? So can you shed light to how you think, with the level and the realities of countries, developing countries who do not really have the resources to finance, how do you think, what innovative measures should be put in place, to galvanize finances and resources to penetrate every areas of education in their country?
It is important to know that multinational companies actually are very powerful, and some of them have actually a lot of money, to the extent that they own more resources than single countries. So the bargaining power for most countries, even when they enter into PPPs, do not seem to be benefiting the people. And the most important thing that you must know is that private sector is for profit. So projects done with private sector will be slightly more expensive because of the experts that you need to bring in. And they become too costly to pay back to governments. And this is how we have accrued debts, actually. And this is why, if you look at the statistics, you'll see that countries that are in debt also are countries that are high on the ladder of countries that are losing a lot of tax in terms of illicit financial flows on an annual basis. In my country here, we lose, for instance, $635 million on yearly basis. And the $602 million of this money is lost through, multinational companies. The individuals only constitute for, about 33 million US dollars in a year. So you can see these dynamics and the fact that, we need just to depend on our progressive taxes. But the most important thing, again, in your question, is the fact that we need to realize that for us to generate enough resources domestically, we need to, put systems of accountability, systems that are going to be open and allow people to be able to, support governments in creating those robust systems for tax collection, even as we broaden the tax, bases in our country. Also ensuring that, the involvement of civil society, especially, in advising government, not only on the expenditure side, as they always, accuse us, but also on the revenue side of the budget, becomes very strong. I think that is what is going to, because now if you look at most countries in Africa, even rich countries, which we say they have a lot of minerals on paper, they get most of their, money from income tax, which they get from, their citizens, as opposed to the companies that are actually exploiting those resources.
Thank you very much, Judge. The key word here is accountability, because it would require a level of accountability and transparency to ensure that resources are well managed. Also, we know, obviously, that domestic financing is the most reliable and significant source of education financing. But in this time of economic downturn, we are seeing education budgets shrink in many GPE partner countries. So what needs to be done to reverse this trend?
Perhaps I will connect also with what George said earlier. First of all, domestic financing already makes up 97% of global financing for education. Only 3% of education financing comes in aid or loans. So any systemic solution to financing gaps needs action on domestic financing. But many governments find their hands tied, and this is the real problem, George. They find their hands tied in increasing domestic financing because they are forced to follow the guidance of the Bretton Woods institutions like IMF, who continue to routinely recommend cuts in public spending that have a devastating impact on education. It's possible that you actually have money, but you can't invest it in the sectors that you really know are important because of all of these caps, be they, recruitment ceilings on wage bills. So there is that policy problem over and above resources. The Transforming Education Summit last year outlined a very bold agenda for transforming the financing of education, recognizing that the most important thing the international community can do is to act to change the global financing architecture that is undermining investment in education. This is very important, and it's a slightly different twist and problem to what George has been explaining, which is equally important. The Transforming Education Summit also called for action on tax to change how global rules are set and to stop illicit financing flows. Africa, for instance, loses much more in illicit financial flows than it gains in aid. This system really must change. Any country that expands its tax to GDP ratio by 5 percentage points, for instance, could double its spending on education and health. The Transforming Education Summit as well called for action on debt. For any country paying more in debt servicing than on education, just how can you be paying loans and debt servicing much less than what you put in education and health, for instance? It also called for action to end austerity policies of the IMF, and particularly the recommendation of cuts or freezes to the public sector wage bill that has so damaged the teaching profession. Both my parents are teachers. I've lived through their lives. I know what they go through. Despite all that they contribute to the welfare, not just of families, but of countries, the way they survive in many of our countries' teachers is simply unacceptable. Even in the economic downturn, which is your important question, there is potential to massively increase investments in education if governments are supported to take bold and progressive action on tax, escape the debt trap, and pursue more expansionary economic policies that see spending on education as a sound long-term investment rather than a short-term consumption expenditure. This is very important to clarify, because it's easy to just say, investment in education is just consumption. It's not true. In the long term, it's actually a huge investment. We need a change of mindset, therefore, to get out of the education bubble, to take the case for investment in education to global spaces where education is normally not discussed. Of course, the Transforming Education Summit also called for more aid to education, arguing that if national governments are advised to spend 15 to 20% of their budgets on education, then 15 to 20% of aid ought to be allocated to education. That would be transformative for many countries, especially in Africa.
Yes, thank you so much, Abdul. As a follow-up question to your contributions, they're already spending on education in the various countries. And we don't just face the crisis of access anymore. There's another pandemic of children who are already in schools, but they're not learning. So how do we ensure that the financing, the funding that is being, currently being spent on education is is effective? The children actually learn what they ought to learn. So how do we go about that? How do we ensure that it's effective? We would always rave about, oh, there are a lot of out-of-school children in Africa. But now, how about those who are in school and they're not learning? How do we make financing effective?
Very quickly, like I said earlier, it comes back to the why question, which is, unless we have the power, and like George says, the control of education financing, in other words, decolonize the decision-making around education financing, we will remain in a perpetual cycle of low investment and low education outcomes. So if you are not allowed to invest in infrastructure, for instance, how do you expect to improve teacher-pupil ratio? If you are not allowed to invest in your teachers and their welfare, how are you going to get quality education, quality teaching and learning materials for our children? So it's a cycle. It's a cycle of low investment, low return. Like we say, sometimes you pretend to be working and therefore the outcomes are also a pretext. So I think that's the cycle we need to break.
Maybe just to comment also on that, I think that is well said by Arthur. The issue really of ensuring that learning is taking place in the classroom is very critical. But above all, it is important that we look at both the investment as well as our curricula, so that we can make them, relevant. We can localize them and ensure that they respond, to the opportunities that exist within our environment. The unfortunate situation actually is that there's been, a call, for instance, 10 years ago on countries focusing on investments in primary education. And by 2015, most of the countries actually had reached near universal access to primary education, but we have not seen the development outcomes resulting from that. The narrative now has shifted and it's looking at other lower levels of education, such as early childhood education, which is a foundation, and they are very important. But the problem really is that the narrative also is emphasizing only one sector, one subsector, and is making this child look like they are a compartment. They can fund early childhood and ignore what happens in primary, in secondary, and in tertiary. They can fund early childhood, primary, ignore what happens in secondary and in tertiary. When this is the same child that we are trying to help, walk through this road where they will end up with skills that are going to be, important. So if learning is to take place, first and foremost, I think we need to have relevant curriculum that focus on our opportunities. And we need, of course, like we have heard, to ensure that we have no constraints in terms of procuring the inputs of quality, teachers inclusive, as we have heard. And once we address those issues, we are going to, see, some change.
Thank you so much, Arthur. Thank you so much. So my next question will be to George. In Zambia, for example, you work to hold the government accountable for delivering on its education promises, including through financing. How can we shift the narrative around education from an expense to an investment, for economic growth and development?
The work that we are doing actually in Zambia in terms of holding government accountable to promises, especially made, like now we are focusing on the promises that were made as part of the Transforming Education Summit. We have, of course, been doing a lot of work as alliances here involving ActionAid and the National Action for Quality Education in Zambia. Just tomorrow, we have a pre-budget forum that is part of the Global Action Week, where we are bringing the Minister of Finance as well as the Minister of Education to discuss the priorities for the 2024 budget. So we've been doing a lot of budget input work work around monitoring the budget as well as reviewing the performance of the education budget in general, which we have also been requested to be doing to be reporting to Parliament on quarterly basis. Now, education, like you have said, should not be seen as an expenditure. I've spoken to the Minister of Finance actually, and my point has been that if there is any economist, who can convince me that there's a formula to development without education being an input, then I'll retire. Now, education should not be seen as an expenditure, but an investment because of three reasons. First, it is key in increasing productivity of individuals. That translates to increased economic development. Education also is well known to increase labor force participation of citizens, whether girls, boys, children with special education needs, vulnerable children from poor households can participate in the economy if we give them an education, and we will not see any difference. Education is going to be an equalizer for them. Education, like I said, also reduces the probability of being unemployed. If you have been to school and you can't get a job, a white collar job from a company, definitely you can, create a job for yourself. So this is how important education is. Education is what is supposed to be the engine of every, economy. And you may wish to know that examples of countries like, for instance, Ireland, where I started from, that in 1965, Ireland, for instance, had one of the worst, education system. As a result, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, did a study which highlighted the economic and social costs of, the education system that they had at the time. And because of that, in 1967, Ireland declared the free secondary education, which allowed, learners to go to secondary and graduate to skills development. You may wish to know that this actually increased the proportion of the labor force with high level of education attainment. And as a result, the growing educational attainment of the labor force addressed around, added, to about 1% every year to the growth in employment and output. You can imagine. And over the period, for instance, from 1970 coming to 2005, Ireland actually is known as one of the countries in which an annual economic growth of 2% was accounted by increase in human capital. So even before we go further, you can see that just direct investment in the right skills has the potential to be linked directly to the growth in GDP on annual basis. And this is how important we need to view education. So education is an equalizer, very important for all of us. It increases, prosperity in our citizens and shared prosperity for that matter, and also increases innovation, resilience, ability to adapt and adopt, new ways of doing things. And this is why without education, it is very difficult for us to circumvent challenges, even of climate change and others, because then we will not have, the skills and tools to be able to adapt.
Thank you so much. Education is an equalizer. It's a no-brainer. And this, according to data, Africa needs 45 million more jobs. And for us to fill these gaps, we need to, invest in our human capital development, and it can only be possible through education. And so, because of time now, I'm just going to ask my last question to both you and Arthur. So, what is the one message you would love to pass to, education advocates like myself and other people out there?
I think my main message is that to achieve systems change in education financing, an objective that we urgently need to pursue, we must advocate for wider systems change in the economic and financing architecture, reforming global tax rules, acting on debt, and reconsidering macroeconomic policies that continue to be a stranglehold to many countries.
Thank you so much. It's very, very important. System change is really important. Judge, over to you. One message to education advocate like me towards the Global Action Week for education.
First and foremost, it's important to note that states cannot, use aid to transform education. And therefore, we need to invest our resources in domestic taxes and domestic resource mobilization as a hallmark to decolonizing education financing in our countries. We need to start decolonizing education by embracing progressive taxation through levying fair taxes, combating tax evasions, reducing illicit financial flows, and fighting corruption.
That was really, really a robust session. And, there were key profound points that you made. You talked about decolonizing. For us to decolonize education, we need to, assess power dynamics, which is very, very important, because he who calls the pipe, plays the piper, calls the tune. And we need to change that dynamic and own, education financing at the national level. Thank you so much. It's also important for us to, transform education reforms and decolonize education financing. It's a step towards the right direction in improving education, at the national level. And I encourage viewers to join the Global Action Week for Education and support the call to action. Thank you very much.